Supporters of former President Donald Trump have allegedly published the purported names and addresses of the grand jurors in Georgia's case against Trump and his co-conspirators for attempting to overthrow the 2020 election on a fringe website. This, according to NBC News. Nonpartisan research group Advanced Democracy first found the leak.
Per the outlet, DA Fani Willis, who handed Trump the fourth and latest indictment, has also been the target of racial threats, for which additional security has been put in place. The Fulton County Sheriff's Office acknowledged knowing about the personal information being released on platforms, telling NBC News that they are treating this incident seriously and are working with law enforcement to respond to credible threats. So this is shocking. We have Donald Trump saying, because of my public presence, this is going to influence the trial. It's going to be really difficult for me to get a fair trial for all of these indictments. But I think also his base of supporters can influence the process of justice, just having a fair trial, having a reasonable trial, having a jury that feels safe. Making a decision on the trial. The fact that the DA's office is getting these threats suggests that those same threats could then be put on the prosecutor, that the prosecutor's team that's working on the case, the jury on the case. And so I think Donald Trump has really played the victim here in saying that because of his public presence, the legal process is going to be influenced in a direction that leads to an unfavorable result for him. I think likewise, his public presence is resulting in a lot of stress for the prosecutors on the case and everyone involved in the legal process.
They definitely should not have released the names of these jurors. They deserve their privacy. And I think it's unfortunately an all too common trend in our modern justice system that when political actors get involved, these things quickly become public nature in the attempts to intimidate potentially jurors, judges, and prosecutors. I mean, just recently there was a case involving Andy Ngo and the attacks on him from Antifa. He was physically attacked and also threatened multiple times by Antifa. And that case was a disaster because the lawyer who was representing the Antifa members was also a member of Antifa. And there were several Antifa members who would stand outside of the courthouse and threaten the jurors and basically try to intimidate them into returning a not guilty verdict. So this is unfortunately happening across the board, and I don't know how we return to a place where jurors can have their information remain private and be free from attempts to intimidate, given how public these justice processes have become.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It extends to the political process as well. I mean, you're kind of opening yourself up to a little bit more of public scrutiny by working on a political campaign. But I remember on the Bernie 2020 campaign, there were organizers who were knocking doors and making calls because they wanted Bernie Sanders to become president. It's a normal part of our democratic process that if you like a candidate, to talk to your neighbors and your friends about that candidate, to knock doors, make phone calls. But there were a lot of organizers that became the target of Project Veritas, secretly recording them, then posting videos of what they were saying about their political views, and then posting their address online, and people who have political views in the opposite direction, then threatening them to come and find them, come to their house, threatening their families. And there comes a point when we have to realize that the battle of ideas is not won by attacking individuals, that you can make some individuals, whether it's the grand jury in this case that decided Trump should be indicted, or whether it's, just people who believe things that are the opposite of your opinions politically, that by removing certain individuals, by threatening certain individuals, you're not really doing much to further your opinions in the battle of ideas, because there are hundreds of thousands of people who might feel the same exact way as they did. And if you were on the jury with the evidence presented and the instruction you had from the judge, you might actually arrive at the same conclusion. You weren't a part of the jury for that trial. So to threaten individuals jeopardizes our democratic process and our justice process, both of which need a ton of work. But threatening individuals, I just don't think is the way to get an agenda passed, no matter how much you believe in it.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the protest that took place after the Dobbs decision was leaked to Politico. I mean, we had individuals rioting essentially outside of Supreme Court justices' homes for weeks. Attorney General Merrick Garland didn't do anything about it, even though it's illegal to try to intimidate a Supreme Court justice. And it led to the point where one individual traveled all the way across the country in the hopes of trying to assassinate Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Now, on the Georgia case, President Trump canceled a much-anticipated press conference planned for next week, during which he was supposed to reveal evidence that would clear him and his co-conspirators of any wrongdoing.
He took to his platform, his social platform last night, Truth Social, writing, quote, "Rather than releasing the report on the rigged and stolen Georgia 2020 presidential election on Monday, my lawyers would prefer putting this, I believe, irrefutable and overwhelming evidence of election fraud and irregularities in formal legal filings as we fight to dismiss the disgraceful indictment." He further exclaimed, therefore, the news conference is no longer necessary. So interesting moves from the Trump team. I don't know if posting to Truth Social is really going to influence the narrative that much because his base is already on his side. But Trump making this statement that we have evidence of fraud in Georgia, I think is one that he might eventually have to answer for in court as well. He said multiple times in speeches, I do believe that the election was stolen. I did believe it at the time. But then there are messages where he says, find the votes, and that he knows he lost. So I think these, contradicting statements, some made in public, some made in private, are going to come around to hurt him when they're released or they're entered into court as evidence and released publicly, thanks to these trials.
I definitely suspect his lawyers told him to hold off on releasing any evidence publicly and saving it for the courtroom, which I think is a wise decision when you're under an indictment like this. And I think the lawyers have a good case for defending Trump here. I mean, basically what this boils down to is whether or not Trump was participating in protected First Amendment activity. And the Georgia indictment is, first of all, absurd to charge him under RICO, which is usually reserved for basically the worst drug cartels and criminal organizations that operate internationally. I mean, the idea that trying to make a public case about voter fraud should be charged under that, I think, is pretty ridiculous. But there's an article from Andy McCarthy in The Messenger that I think really breaks down the case quite well, which is that trying to change an election outcome is not illegal. Even if Trump was saying privately that he wasn't sure if they had the evidence for fraud, investigating it, asking for recounts, asking for votes to be thrown away if they're illegitimate, and double check to make sure that the ones that are counted are legitimate is not a crime. That's a normal part of the political process. So you could get Trump and his alleged co-conspirators if they did illegal things in pursuit of that goal, but the goal itself is not illegal. And they haven't shown any evidence in this Georgia indictment that in the process of trying to change the outcome that they did anything illegal. So I don't know how this is going to go. I mean, even just reading the indictment, there's so many ridiculous pieces of so-called evidence that they use here. Act 22, for example, says, on or about the third day of December 2020, Donald John Trump caused to be tweeted from the Twitter account @RealDonaldTrump, quote, "Georgia hearings now on One America News. Amazing." They describe this as an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy, a tweet telling people to watch One America News. I don't see how this is going to go anywhere. I think this DA is probably trying to make some political bones out of this. She's already fundraised a bunch of money for her re-election campaign. And I think that's what this is all about. I mean, we also see that the former lieutenant governor of Georgia is on CNN or MSNBC, kind of interchangeable to me, to be honest, talking about how Trump blew up the party in Georgia and how this is essentially personal for him. And that's what I think it is. It's personal for a lot of people in Georgia, but that doesn't mean it's criminal.
Yeah, I think Donald Trump's trial hinges on this one fact, and it's whether or not he genuinely believed that he won in Georgia and that the election was rigged. Because I think there's a world where the prosecutors will be able to prove that in private, he knew that he lost. He knew that the integrity of the election was there and that he lost fair and square in Georgia, and was pushing this idea that he may have lost due to fraud. and pushing that idea, which he knew was a lie, willingly to cast doubt on the electoral process.
It's not a crime to
cast
lie,
doubt on the
though.
strength of our democracy. I think if they prove that, which they can, then he becomes guilty of, pushing this idea of election fraud on people to make them not believe in our democracy anymore. That's something that's kind of dangerous for our country. So I think if they can prove that he didn't genuinely believe it's fraud, they have a pretty strong case there. And I think that's why he's focusing so much of his time on his speeches on that.
I think you could make the case that it's immoral to say things that you don't believe are true and get other people to believe them, but I'd be hard-pressed to say that that's criminal. In that case, we'd probably have to put every politician in jail.
I mean, I do believe it is criminal to make people believe that our electoral process isn't sound when it is. I think that's something that's dangerous for the country when you're in that high of a public office, when you have that much public attention. That's why he's been indicted, is because that is criminal. And so I think there's a reason that there are exceptions to the free speech, right in the United States. The exception that you can't say things that are slanderous of other people, no hate speech, no spreading violence. And I think there is a case to be made in DC for Donald Trump that he did have a hand in inspiring the January 6th insurrection and riot, and that he did rile people up and encourage them to go to the Capitol on that day. So we'll see how these things play out. But I think there's a reason that these things are criminal and that there's an exception in the free speech law. And it's because they're dangerous, not just for our country, but for the people who died on January 6th.
I think we'd be hard-pressed to find an objective standard of what speech is dangerous when it comes to challenging elections, considering that Democrats like Stacey Abrams refused to concede in her own case in Georgia, and yet somehow she hasn't been indicted. We'll be back with more Rising after this.